One cocky rookie, one seasoned judge, one brutal lesson about real authority. And everybody saw it happen. They say confidence is good, but cockiness? That's where trouble starts. And nobody was a better example of that than Officer Bryce Callahan. It was a Thursday morning in Toledo, Ohio, and the air outside the courthouse was already heating up. Not just the weather, but the energy. Inside those stone walls, something was about to go down that no one saw coming. Bryce, barely 23 years old, walked through the courthouse doors like he owned the place. Freshly pressed uniform, shiny badge, sunglasses still hooked on his collar. He wasn't just proud. He thought he was the law. Just a few months out of the academy, and in his mind, he knew everything he needed to know. The case? Simple. Open and shut, at least to Bryce. He had pulled over a guy for rolling through a stop sign, issued a ticket, wrote his report. Now he was here to testify because the driver decided to contest it. Routine, right? But the way Bryce strutted into that courtroom, you would have thought he was about to argue a case in front of the Supreme Court. He didn't notice the older lawyers giving him a once-over. He didn't catch the small, amused smiles from the clerks. He didn't see the bailiff shake his head just a little. Bryce thought they were all looking at him with admiration. Truth was, most of them had seen 100 rookies like him before, and they knew exactly where this was headed. Bryce plopped himself into a hard wooden chair near the front. He sat stiff, like he was daring someone to challenge him. His fingers tapped impatiently on the table. He leaned back and kept adjusting his badge so it would catch the light just right. Across the aisle, an older woman in a navy blue pantsuit whispered to her colleague, not even trying that hard to keep her voice down. "Fresh meat," she said with a smirk. Her friend chuckled under her breath, but Bryce didn't catch it, or maybe he just didn't care. The door behind the judge's bench opened, and in walked Judge Roosevelt Bannister. The room shifted immediately, not because he made some big entrance. Bannister was quiet, controlled, but because his presence commanded attention. Tall, broad-shouldered, silver hair at his temples, and a face lined by years of hard decisions and even harder truths. He didn't look like a man you could bluff or bulldoze. "All rise," the bailiff called out. Everyone stood, Bryce too, though he was slower about it than he should have been. Judge Bannister took his seat and glanced down at the docket. "Traffic violation, contested citation," he said in a deep, even voice. "Let's proceed." Bryce almost smiled to himself. This was going to be over in minutes. He'd tell his side, the judge would believe him, case closed. Maybe he'd even get a compliment afterward for doing everything by the book. But he had no idea who he was dealing with. Bryce thought this was just another easy win, but the courtroom had other plans for him. Bryce barely listened as the court clerk read out the case details. His mind was already 10 steps ahead, rehearsing how he'd answer the questions. He'd done this before in mock trials at the academy. Smooth talking, sharp answers, easy money. Judge Bannister adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. "Officer Callahan," he said, voice calm but carrying weight. "You're up." Bryce stood, tugging at his belt like he was ready for a showdown. He approached the witness stand with a slight swagger, the kind you only catch if you're looking for it. The prosecutor, a short man with thinning hair and a tired look about him, stood up too. "State your name and occupation for the record." "Bryce Callahan, officer with the Toledo Police Department," Bryce said, clear and loud. He even squared his shoulders a little. The prosecutor nodded. "Walk us through what happened the morning of March 18th. Bryce launched into his story, voice steady, words clipped. He made sure to sprinkle in words like non-compliant and observation skills. He sounded rehearsed, too rehearsed. The court reporter's keys clicked quietly as she recorded everything, but the silence in the room felt heavier with each word he spoke. When the prosecutor finished, it was time for the defense attorney to cross-examine. She was a woman in her mid-50s, with thick glasses and a sharp stare. Her name was Nadine Hollowell, and she had been practicing law longer than Bryce had been alive. She stood up slowly, papers in hand. "Officer Callahan," she said smoothly, "you mentioned that the driver rolled through the stop sign. Can you tell me, from your exact position, how many feet away you were from the intersection?" Bryce blinked. He hadn't expected that. In training, they always told him to know the details, but on that morning, he hadn't measured. He'd just written what he thought he saw. "I was close enough," Bryce said, shrugging a little. Murmurs ran through the gallery. Judge Bannister's eyebrows twitched upward. Not much, but enough. "Close enough. Hollowell repeated, smiling thinly. Would you say 20 feet, 50, 100? Bryce shifted. Maybe 30? Hollowell nodded politely. Thank you, officer. She turned back toward her table, but then she paused and glanced at the judge. Your Honor, she said, I may have further questions pending the witnesses' responses. Proceed, Judge Bannister said, still calm. Bryce stood there, feeling the first hint of something slipping. He clutched his belt tighter. Maybe he could still turn this around. But what he did next only made it worse. As Hollowell approached again, Bryce cut her off. Ma'am, with all due respect, he said, voice louder than necessary. I know what I saw. I don't need a tape measure to prove it. You could almost hear the intake of breath from the people sitting in the gallery. The prosecutor closed his eyes for half a second. The bailiff shifted his weight. Judge Bannister didn't say a word. He just stared at Bryce. Long, hard, like he was measuring something invisible. Bryce, oblivious, kept talking. I've been trained to make quick assessments. I don't second-guess myself in the field. That's what keeps people safe. There it was. The badge pride talking. Loud, raw, unfiltered. The defense attorney didn't even argue. She just smiled faintly and sat back down like she knew she didn't have to lift another finger. Judge Bannister leaned forward slightly, folding his hands together. Officer Callahan, he said, voice even quieter now. A courtroom isn't the field. Here, words are evidence. Precision matters. Bryce opened his mouth to respond, but Judge Bannister raised a hand. Sit down. It wasn't a yell. It wasn't angry. It was worse. It was final. Bryce hesitated, but the command in that voice left no room for debate. He slumped back into his seat, staring ahead, cheeks burning. Bryce thought he could control the room with his badge, but respect was something he hadn't earned yet. For a moment, the courtroom felt frozen. Bryce sat stiffly, trying to mask the flush creeping up his neck. He stared at the floor like it had answers. Across the room, the older attorneys exchanged glances. Not smug, not cruel, just the kind that said, yeah, we've seen this before. Judge Bannister took off his glasses and cleaned them slowly with a handkerchief he pulled from his robe. The silence stretched, not heavy, not loud, just long. Finally, Bannister slid his glasses back on, laced his fingers together, and spoke. This court expects respect for the process, he said, voice cutting through the tension. Respect for the people sitting in those chairs, and respect for the truth. Bryce shifted again. He couldn't help it. The bench that had felt solid a few minutes ago now felt like it might collapse under him. The defense attorney stood back up, clearing her throat. Your Honor, she said carefully, given the officer's uncertainty about the distance and the tone taken during testimony, I respectfully request a dismissal of the citation. Bryce's head snapped up. Dismissal? For that? He turned halfway in his seat, about to object, but Bannister caught him with just a look. No need for further argument, Bannister said firmly. He tapped his gavel once on the bench. Motion granted. Case dismissed. The defendant, a middle-aged man in a worn brown jacket, gave a quiet sigh of relief. He leaned over and whispered thanks to his lawyer. Bryce, meanwhile, sat there stunned. It wasn't just losing the case, it was how he lost, how it made him feel, small, embarrassed, exposed. Bannister leaned forward, eyes locked on Bryce like he was reaching into the rookie's chest and weighing his heart. Officer Callahan, the judge said, steady but serious, I'd like you to remain after the court is adjourned. It wasn't a request. A few folks in the gallery exchanged wide-eyed looks. The prosecutor gathered his files without a word. The clerk started stacking papers faster than usual, eager to be anywhere but there. Bryce stayed frozen in his chair, wondering if maybe, just maybe, he'd made a bigger mistake than he realized. The courtroom emptied, but Bryce's world was about to get a lot smaller and a whole lot heavier. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind the last few people leaving. The room felt emptier now, somehow colder. Bryce sat stiffly, his palms sweating against the fabric of his uniform pants. Judge Bannister didn't speak right away. Instead, he finished scribbling something on a yellow notepad, flipped it closed, and set his pen down with a soft click. The sound felt louder than it should have. Finally, Bannister lifted his eyes and pinned Bryce with a look that said, You're not walking out of here the same way you walked in. You know why I asked you to stay behind? The judge asked. Bryce cleared his throat. "No, Your Honor," he said, voice smaller than he meant it to be. Bannister nodded slowly, almost like he wasn't surprised. "You're new," Bannister said. "That's obvious. And that's not a crime. But arrogance in this building, in any building where the law is practiced, that is dangerous." Bryce opened his mouth to protest. Instinct, not thought. But Bannister raised a hand again, a slight movement, enough to shut him down. "You think that badge gives you power," Bannister said, voice deep, steady. "And it does, in a way, but it also puts a target on your back, and it makes you responsible for every decision you make, especially when nobody's watching." Bryce sat frozen, barely breathing. Bannister leaned forward now, both elbows on the bench. "Out there in the street, maybe you can bluff and bark orders. Maybe that works for a minute. But in here, it's about facts, about truth, about humility." He let the word hang in the air, not heavy, just true. "You treated that courtroom today like it was a competition," Bannister continued, "like your pride mattered more than the law. And you embarrassed yourself. Worse, you disrespected the oath you swore to uphold." Bryce swallowed hard. His hands fumbled slightly at his sides, the bravado draining out of him like water from a cracked bucket. "You think you're tough because you wear a uniform?" Bannister asked, voice sharpening just a little. "Real toughness," he said, tapping his chest with one thick finger, "comes from knowing when to shut up, knowing when to listen, knowing when you're wrong." Bryce blinked rapidly, staring at the worn wood grain of the floor. "You got lucky today, son," Bannister said. "If I wanted, I could file a formal complaint about your conduct in court. I could have the department hear about it before you even get back to your cruiser." Bryce felt his chest tighten. He shook his head slightly. No, Your Honor," he mumbled. "Please." Bannister sat back slowly, studying him. "I'm not going to," the judge said after a beat. "Because you're young, and because maybe, just maybe, you'll remember this moment when it counts." Bryce looked up, meeting the judge's eyes for the first time without the shield of his pride. There was no hatred there, no smugness, just a man who had seen more than Bryce could even imagine, and who maybe wanted to save him from becoming another cautionary tale. Bannister's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "You are not the badge," he said. "You are the decisions you make wearing it." The words cut deeper than any shouting ever could. Bryce nodded slowly. For once, no smart comments, no excuses, just understanding. "You're dismissed," Bannister said. Bryce stood up, stiff and awkward. He gave a small nod, not out of habit, but out of real respect, and walked out the courtroom door feeling 10 pounds lighter and 100 pounds heavier all at the same time. But outside that courtroom, Bryce realized something. The real work was just beginning. Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun hit Bryce square in the face. But he didn't squint. He didn't reach for his sunglasses. He just stood there for a second, letting the heat soak into his skin, trying to process everything that had just happened. He felt different. Not broken, just cracked open enough to see the truth. As Bryce walked slowly to his cruiser, badge catching the sunlight, he realized for the first time that being an officer wasn't about how many tickets you wrote or how sharp your uniform looked. It wasn't about being right all the time. It was about serving. Even when nobody said thank you, even when it hurt your pride. He climbed into his car and sat there, hands resting lightly on the wheel. The echoes of Judge Bannister's words were still fresh in his mind. "You're not the badge. You are the decisions you make wearing it." Bryce looked down at the gold badge pinned to his chest. It didn't shine quite as brightly anymore, but maybe that was a good thing. Maybe now he could actually see what it meant. Across the street, he noticed a woman struggling with a busted stroller, trying to corral 2 small kids and a bag of groceries spilling onto the sidewalk. A few weeks ago, Bryce might have just looked away. Not his problem, he would have thought. Stay in your lane. Do your job. But today felt different. Bryce slid out of his cruiser, walked across the street, and bent down to help gather the groceries. The woman looked up, startled at first, then smiled gratefully. "Thank you," she said. "No problem, ma'am," Bryce answered, this time without any swagger, just sincerity. As he walked back to his car, something small but important shifted inside him. It wasn't about looking strong. It was about being strong, in patience, in kindness, in humility. That day in court hadn't been about losing a case. It had been about finding a piece of himself he didn't even know was missing. And he knew, deep down, that years from now, after thousands of calls, hundreds of shifts, and more mistakes than he cared to count, he'd still remember the day Judge Bannister looked him straight in the eye and demanded more from him. Because sometimes, the hardest lessons leave the deepest marks. When you wear any kind of responsibility, a badge, a title, or even just your name, remember this. Respect is never owed. It's earned, moment by moment, choice by choice. So ask yourself, are you living in a way that honors what you carry?